Okay, so here's where we are. Hegel, as I said before, is trying to use logic in order for us to be able to understand where our awareness of who we are comes from. What is it that allows us to claim that I am me? So if you think about it, this is not some nonsensical issue, right? One of the differences between us and any baby younger than 12 months, 18 months, some researchers claim. But think about any baby who is at that stage where they're developing language. Don't they usually talk about themselves in the third person? If they see themselves in the mirror, they don't recognize themselves. So there's this, even though there's awareness of their existence, there's not really awareness of what that existence means, where it begins and where does it end, right? So this is why Hegel tries to go from this general consciousness, of which I will speak about in a second, to my consciousness of who I am, or how he calls it, self consciousness. This is one of the most complicated texts I have ever read in my whole life. I remember having to read like 5 pages of Hegel for one of my classes in grad school, and of course, it's 5 pages when you're used to reading 70 or more. So I went out the whole weekend, came back Sunday night, and tried to read 5 pages of Hegel. It was probably 4 a.m. when I went to bed, right? So Hegel is a complicated philosopher, but I think that it is it is worth our time to examine what he says in Master Slave, especially. So here we go. When Hegel claims that there is a consciousness and that consciousness is going to be exposed in the form of being for self or self consciousness, he is giving us this step by step breakdown of how consciousness starts acquiring that concept of self. So in segment 186, he says, these consciousness that are in a metaphysical sense existing, they are for each other shapes of consciousness which have not yet accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction, of rooting out all immediate being and of being merely the purely negative being of self-identical consciousness. And this is where he makes it easier, right? In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self or as self consciousness. Now, I think my Hegel professor would kill me if she saw me doing this, but imagine that all that I have on the screen in that like teal color is consciousness. There are definitely, we can see two consciousness that form part of that most general realm, but these two consciousness have no way of relating to one another, right? So think about when you are in a very dark room. You know that you are in a very dark room, but you don't know what else is in that dark room. You don't know how else to claim what your space is, right? Because you don't know if you move yourself a little bit, you don't know if you're going to bump into a wall or if you're going to bump into somebody else. So think about that as the metaphysical consciousness of which Hegel is speaking of. And he believes that we are all part of that general consciousness from which everything has been formed. So he tells us that what we're trying to achieve here in this part of the phenomenology is self consciousness. And what is self consciousness? Is this essence of being the I. this individual, this being for myself. So this moment when I recognize that I am not alone in that room and that I know my limits, I know how much I can extend myself, right? And of course, whenever I talk about the room or whenever I show you the drawings, these are all just approximations to what he is claiming. We need to understand that what he is claiming is both phenomenologically possible, but we also do not experience it. We are not aware of this happening. So he says that self consciousness is this simple being for self, self equal, through the exclusion from itself of everything else. So here we have that negative dialectic of which I was talking about in the introduction. How do I know that this is who I am? Because I know that those other things do not belong to me. There's a negation that makes me affirm who I am a little bit in a clearer way. For it, for self consciousness, its essence and absolute object is I. And in this immediacy, or I, this mere being of its being for itself, it is an individual. So for Hegel, this is how individuality is gained. This is the sort of movement that we have to make in order to recognize ourselves as one single individual. So what we're going to end up having in Hegel is a diagram that looks something like this. There are going to be different consciousness that are going to be able to establish themselves, to have clear limits, and to be able to call themselves I. There is going to be a consciousness that is related through nature, and there's another consciousness that is related through power. I'll explain in a second which one of them is the master and which one of them is the slave. So, how do these consciousness define themselves? Here is where Hegel starts this very interesting, fascinating movement through which those abstract consciousness are going to gain an awareness of themselves. And he says here that we are going to use a negatively characterized object, right? So that object that is going to confront me is going to be negative, not because it's doing something negative, because I know that it is not me, right? This encounter or this self-consciousness is going to be recognized in the immediacy of life. So this is a way in which we become aware of our existence, right? And one of the previous steps that we have to know is that each one of these figures is certain of its own existence, but not of the other. So again, think about yourselves in like a movie theater. You're watching the movie, everything is like very dark, and all of a sudden you move your arm on the seat only to see that you are elbowing someone else, that there is someone in that point. It's not like you didn't know that you existed, it's that you didn't know your limits were in that place. So that's sort of what I try to do with this diagram, in which we're going to have these two awareness, these two consciousness all of a sudden recognize one another and come to this realization like, oh wait, this is not all there is. I am not all there is. And for some reason the screen doesn't capture that this is all happening in life, right? So probably this means that it only happens to creatures that are alive. um, Probably there's some sort of awareness, maybe not fully of master slave awareness, that happens to animals and other beings, but there has to be something that Hegel wants to tell us by this point, that this sort of awareness happens in the immediacies of life. So he says that after the first encounter that these two awareness had, they're going to start recognizing each other as separate beings, right? each one showing itself as a pure negation of its objective mode. So I'm going to show myself as a negation of you. I am not you, and in that separation, I affirm myself. But for Hegel, and this is something that you guys can criticize, he calls this process a life and death struggle. Right? So we're going to have not only that I recognize myself when I'm elbowing the other person, but that in order to separate myself, we're going to have a life or death struggle. This is the process through which this separation truly occurs. And it's going to need, according to segment 187, it's going to need a twofold action. Each one of the awarenesses, each one of the consciousness needs to seek the death of the other. And then each one of the two awarenesses is going to stake its own life. And I'll come back to explain how that happens.